Great to be back with you again, and I always love coming to Idaho. I might just begin by saying that I hope I can talk about winning the culture war better than I can talk about winning at chess. We had some pretty strong opposition, even though we outnumbered our opponent. Also, I could talk about martial arts here a great deal. And I am a third-degree black belt with the American Taekwondo Foundation, fifth degree with the Black Belts of the Faith International, but one thing they both have in common, you can plan out your strategies, you can plan out moves in advance that you're going to make, but there's just one problem with them all. Your opponent doesn't always do what you expect him to do. And that's true in the culture war, just like it's true in most other kinds of war. So as we talk about winning the culture war, one thing that came to my mind was a time back in the mid-1990s. I was at the Air Force Academy, and our son David was a cadet there at the Air Force Academy, and he had just gone through the POW survival training. They hold that out in the mountains west of Colorado Springs at a location they don't disclose. But I was able to go to the graduation ceremony afterward, and I remember what Colonel Stokes told the cadets as they were graduating. He said, "I have good news and bad news. The good news is it's over. You will never have to go through POW survival training again. The bad news is it's over. You will never go through POW survival training again. Next time you go through a situation like this, it will be for real. And it will be a come-as-you-are party. You won't have a chance to prepare." First thing I'm going to stress about the culture war is that we need to know that we're in a culture war. That's one of the problems as far as a war with Islam, for example. They know we're in a holy war with Islam. Most Christians don't. They know, and the secularists know, that we are in a culture war. Most Christians don't. Obviously, coming to a session like this for the weekend, and my sympathies to all of you that on a beautiful day like this, you would choose to spend it listening to a boring speaker like me, and instead of being outside with the beauties of the mountains around you and the beautiful air that you feel here. But obviously, you're here because you know that there is a culture war going on and you want to be trained so you can be prepared. Sorry to say, the average Christian, including the average Bible-believing fundamental Christian, doesn't really think that we're in war. He doesn't even think we're in training. He doesn't think about boot camp. He thinks about church socials. First thing we need to know about a culture war is that there is a war going on. Second thing I'd ask us to notice about the culture war is that we need to know what it's all about. What is the culture war over? First of all, we need to recognize that a culture war is over basic values. It's over what values will be the principles that govern America. What values will be reflected in our leaders, our institutions, our laws, our culture, our music, our recreation, our literature? What will be the governing values? That's what the culture war is all about. And we have, first of all, a biblical worldview. Obviously, I can't give you a full biblical worldview right now. Most of you, I'm sure, have a good idea of a biblical worldview already. And again, my problem here is that I am preaching to the choir. The very fact that you're willing to come out for something like this evening and today and last night and tomorrow tells me that you are well aware of these things and you want to be informed more. If you want to enjoy nature outside, let me give you a way you can do it. If you can find a Christian person who needs to know these things but isn't motivated and get that person to come tomorrow in your place, you can be excused. That's the unfortunate thing. The people that need to know about this are the ones who aren't here, and the people that, not that I'm not going to say things that you don't need to know, but obviously you've got the right motivation at least, or you wouldn't be here at all. But we hold a basic biblical worldview, which we could probably summarize with a few principles. First, that God created the universe and he governs it in accordance with his laws, physical and moral. Second, that man is created in God's image, and therefore man is of infinite value, and human life is of infinite value. Third, that man is a sinner. He is therefore separated from God and fallen from the state of grace. Fourth, that salvation comes through the cross, through Jesus Christ, who died on a cross for our sins. And that God has ordained not only the church to proclaim the gospel and lead people to Christ and salvation, but also the state. And God has ordained the state for very limited purposes. Purpose of restraining the exercise of sin and thereby enabling us to live our lives peaceably. Now, in contrast to that, we have the secular humanist worldview, which is that the universe is created by chance. And it operates pretty much by chance. Many will say that there are laws by which the universe operates, but if there are, that creates a problem because who ordained those laws and who holds those laws constant? And so the whole idea of anything beyond chance is problematic for the humanist. That man evolved and is continuing to evolve. He, well, as the author of one creationist book put it, and it was a humorous title, maybe not the most academically commanding, but From Goo to You by Way of the Zoo was his title, that we are formed out of a primordial ooze and that have gradually evolved and improved into what we are now, but the process continues, and who knows what we will be evolved into, let's say, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years from now. Third, that man is going to solve his own problems. As the Humanist Manifesto says, no deity will save us. We must save ourselves. We're going to solve our own problems. We're going to create our own paradise here on earth, such as it may be, by the application of human reason using the scientific method. And then, the primary and highest agency that we have to achieve these things for us is the state. Hegel made the statement that the state is God walking on earth. Now, he didn't mean God in the sense that we would use the term God. He meant in more of a sense of the spirit of the age. But that is the highest thing there is in this view. And the state is not simply created by God and accepted by us in a social compact, as John Locke would say, and given certain limited authority to keep law and order and to make sure that certain things run. Rather, the state is an organism. It is the highest organism of all. And we derive our highest expression of humanity by participating in the state. I was amazed by this, and I haven't studied this quite enough back when I was in a debate one time and on a Montgomery radio program over a tax increase for education, and I made clear that my position was I wasn't necessarily opposing some kind of tax increase for education, but I was concerned that before we start spending more money on education, we need to get the direction of it right. We're using failing methods to teach children the wrong values. And throwing more money at a problem like that is just going to make it worse. get the direction straight first. And then I kept insisting that money alone does not guarantee quality education. Methods, values, other things are far more important. Well, the superintendent of schools was my opponent, and he interrupted me right away, and he said, "But isn't it true, John, that at your law school that you are raising several $1,000,000 to build a new building?" I said, "That's true, but we're raising it entirely by private funds." He said, "Well, we'd like to do that too, but we are inviting the public to participate with us through taxation." At first, I could hardly believe what I heard, but according to his worldview, that's exactly what the state does, invites us to participate. And believe it or not, there are those like Hobbes and others who will say that you have your true freedom by giving the state absolute power. Now, that makes no sense at all. What he's saying is that if the state has absolute power, it can do all kinds of things for you, create parks for you, give you the medical care, give you all the advantages you want. And so the only way to have true freedom is to give the state absolute power. Well, I think most of us would say a very flat no to that idea, as did the voters of Montgomery County, Alabama, in that referendum. But the idea that the state is the highest human organism is part of the humanist worldview. Closely related to that, then, is that the state is to be our agency of charity. You know, I've heard it said that a liberal is a person who believes he owes a debt to humanity and wants to pay it with your money. And I think that's a fairly accurate description, actually. What is interesting is to find that conservatives, regardless of income level, contribute a much greater share of their personal wealth to charity each year than do liberals, who supposedly care about the poor more than we do. But when you think about it, there's a reason behind that. I'm not saying that every liberal fully thinks this out, but liberalism resents private charity, because charity should be a function of the state, in their view. In our view, it should be a function of the family or the individual, perhaps the church, but not the state. It's no surprise, then, that President Obama has suggested, maybe not all the way to proposing it yet, that we restrict charitable giving deductions at the higher income levels. It's not surprising at all, in his view. Private charity is resented because it gets in the way of the state's role in this area. Now, understanding these different worldviews may help us to see what the battle is all about. But we need to understand that it is going to be a long-range struggle. It's been going on probably since creation. We certainly see it in this country. We can date it back to Woodrow Wilson or back before that, but really you see many of the same issues raised in the 19th century and in the American colonies before. But the culture war is never going to come to an end so long as time persists. No side, I don't think, is ever going to be able to declare victory. But there are victories. It is also not over any single issue. I've told you what the basic worldviews that are at stake are, but issues go all the way from pornography to the fairness doctrine of what radio stations and TV stations have to do, to foreign policy issues, crime and punishment issues, obviously the right to life issues that concern not only abortion, but also euthanasia, stem cell research, in vitro fertilization, abstinence, adoption, and so many other issues related to that, capital punishment, and as to whether or not, when we're dealing with crime, whether we should forgive everybody and let them go, or lock up the few that we don't execute and throw away the key, or whether The biblical approach is, as I think it is, and as Chuck Colson suggests it is, somewhere in between. But we have a wide variety of issues. And I'm not suggesting to you that you need to be thoroughly versed on every one of those issues. If you do, you'll probably spread yourself way too thin like I do. But figure out which issues God may be calling you to work on. Maybe it's because of a special interest you have. Maybe it's because of special training or ability you have. Maybe it's because of a position you're in where you have contacts and you're able to work in a certain area. Crisis pregnancy centers, perhaps, or who knows what it might be. But there are a wide variety of issues in the culture war. Several nights ago, James Dobson, who of all people who you might identify with the Christian right, might be the most respected and most intellectual, made the statement that we've lost the culture war. Not that it can't ever be started again, but we've lost. With all due respect, I can't quite agree with that. We have suffered some very severe setbacks, and I'll be talking more about the Obama administration and some of the things we're facing there and the Christian response to the Obama administration tomorrow. But I don't think I'd say the war is lost. Nor would I say, as Cal Thomas, another man I respect greatly, seems to suggest, that all the efforts that we have put in have been wasted. For one thing, you find that the pendulum swings politically. And if you go back and look in history, well, I find in the South especially that many conservative people in the South became energized in some of these struggles by Barry Goldwater's campaign back in 1964. And I suspect that may be true of some of the fellow gray-haired people that I see around me here. I know I was vice president of Students for Goldwater at St. Olaf College during that time, and it certainly gripped me. But you almost forget, Goldwater lost in a landslide. Lyndon Johnson beat him with about 61% of the vote. Goldwater carried only 5 southern states plus Arizona. Didn't even carry Idaho, although he came close. But people were saying then, the conservative movement, and probably the Republican Party as well, are dead. And then 2 years later, in '66, there were strong gains in the congressional elections. And 2 years after that, Richard Nixon, a Republican, was elected president. It was a close election. But 4 years after that, he was elected in a tremendous landslide. His opponent at that time, George McGovern, carried only the state of Massachusetts, didn't even carry his own state of South Dakota. Nixon was reelected with over 60% of the vote, and people were saying the Democrat Party is dead. But the obituary was premature. I think of Walter Mondale's words once when he said that he told this to his followers when he'd lost an election and told them not to be discouraged. He said, "In every defeat are the seeds of victory, and in every victory are the seeds of defeat." And there were seeds of defeat back in 1972 in that landslide election. Anybody remember what the seed of defeat was? Watergate. 2 years later, this president that had been elected with 49 states and 61% of the vote had to resign in the face of almost certain impeachment, and they're again saying the Republican Party's dead. Carter's elected in '76. 4 years later, Reagan is elected, re-elected with 49 out of 50 states in '84. Well, as you can see, the pendulum swings back and forth, and it's going to swing again. But another thing I'd mention is that if we haven't seen as much change as we hoped, by virtue of our activism in the culture war, we may be using the wrong means of measuring it. The question to be asked for some people who've been involved maybe 20, 30 years, and as you see it, things aren't really any better than they were before. The question to be asked is not how much better are things now because I've been involved. The question is, how much worse might they be if I had not been involved? And you will never know for sure the answer to that question. But I remember the words of a senator from Idaho back in the 1940s. I didn't hear them at that time. I was about 2 years old at the time he spoke. But Senator William E. Borah, some of you remember that name from Idaho history. He made the statement that of all my votes in the Senate, the votes of which I have been proudest were no votes. I am proudest not of good bills that I have helped to pass, but of bad bills I have helped to defeat. My highest claim for credit is not for the good that I have accomplished, but for the evil I have helped to prevent. And that certainly is an important thing that we need to be doing, strengthen the things that remain. So we've talked about a couple things here. First, know that we are involved in a culture war. Second, know what the culture war is all about. Third thing I'm going to suggest, know the rules of engagement. Now, I've been involved in Taekwondo. The American Taekwondo Federation has many rules that we have to follow when we're sparring with one another. One of the rules in Taekwondo that doesn't apply in certain other organizations is you cannot punch directly to the face. You can punch lower, but not too low. You can kick to the head. That gives you a little more time to respond to a kick than to a punch, but a punch to the face is prohibited. Well then, shortly after I became a black belt, I was at a clinic of the Gospel Martial Arts Union. They have their own system, Sigya Bushido-Ryu, the way of the righteous warrior, which I kind of describe as Taekwondo with a Kung Fu accent. The moves are largely Taekwondo moves, but they use a lot more flexibility and things in them. But it was time for us to spar. And I'm faced off with another black belt. I'm prepared, ready to defend. First thing he does is punch me right to the face. I think, you can't do that. The rules of Taekwondo say, oh, wait a minute. We're not under the rules of Taekwondo, are we? And here, you can punch to the face. Know the rules of engagement. What I'm suggesting here, first of all, especially when we're talking about constitutional rights, the rights of freedom of expression, know what rights Christians have to express themselves in the public arena. Know what things are likely to be prohibited. A couple weeks from now, and I just got a call on this afternoon, but a couple weeks from now, I'm going to be speaking for several groups in Minnesota. And one of the places I'll be speaking is a little north of the Twin Cities, a place called Elk River. And I was just told that they have moved the meeting. The meeting was going to be in a library. They've moved it to a church instead. They've moved it to the library, or to the church from the library, because they found out the library has a policy that when they rent a room to an audience, the room cannot be used for worship or prayer. Well, they should have known the rules first. They should also know, and the library should know, those rules are blatantly unconstitutional. This is the issue we call equal access. The basic principle that if a government agency rents out facilities to various private organizations, they have to rent them out to religious organizations on the same basis as they do to others. This has been reiterated over and over again in Vincent versus Widmar, Supreme Court case from the early 1970s up to the early 1990s, the case of Lamb's Chapel, a case where a school district was renting out its school auditorium to various groups, and the Lamb's Chapel wanted to rent the school auditorium to show a James Dobson film series, and they were denied, saying we don't rent to religious organizations. Case went to the Supreme Court, and by a unanimous vote, the Supreme Court told the school district, you don't have to rent your facility to anybody, but if you rent it to some, you have to rent it to religious organizations on the same basis. You need to know the rules of engagement if you're going to participate successfully. And if you're going to be involved in precinct caucuses and county and state conventions and the like, one thing I suggest is learn parliamentary procedure. You'll probably be the only one who does, and you will be invaluable if you know how parliamentary procedure works. I'll tell you a little secret that I've been parliamentarian for I don't know how many organizations at various times, and I guess I can say that I not only know the rules, but I know how to use them in a fight, and I know how to time them. But one of the things that I'll sometimes do if I'm asked to serve as parliamentarian for an organization, I'll start out by asking, well, what I'll do is I'll leave my briefcase with my copy of Roberts outside. And so I'll begin by asking, does anybody here have a copy of Roberts? And if nobody volunteers a copy of Roberts, well, then I'm going to have to go out and get mine. Excuse me just a minute. If somebody has a copy, then I'll ask, could I borrow that for this session? What have I done? Disarmed a potential opponent. And also learned that the rest of my audience is unarmed. And just one of a number of techniques you can use in that regard. But know the rules of engagement. Fourth thing I'm going to suggest is preparation. There is no substitute for learning the principles, learning the issues, learning the facts. Study the scriptures to see if those things are so, and don't forget, God's word is infallible. My lectures and my books are not. Compare them to God's word. Be like the Bereans that we read about in the book of Acts. Why were they more noble than those of Thessalonica? Because they what? Searched the scriptures to see if these things are so. Not only learn the Bible, learn the Constitution. Learn the principles in the Constitution. What things it authorizes government to do. What things it gives to the various branches of government. What things it withholds from the various branches of government. One of my favorite stories about the Constitution and one of my favorite constitutional heroes is a man by the name of Horatio Bunce. How many of you, other than people who've heard my Institute series or heard my lectures before, how many of you have heard of Horatio Bunce? A few of you have, okay. Well, Horatio Bunce never held public office, but he was a farmer in Tennessee in the 1830s, and he was respected by his neighbors as a man who had a great deal of wisdom and a man who read a lot. You've all heard of his congressman, Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett was running for re-election, and he was campaigning in Horatio Bunce's neighborhood when he saw Bunce and went over to shake his hands and introduce himself and ask for his vote. Bunce immediately said, "I know who you are, sir. You are Colonel David Crockett, our congressman. I voted for you in the last election. I shall not do so again." Crockett asked why, and he said, "Because you violated your oath of office to support and defend the Constitution of the United States." Bunce asked, "Well, how did I do that?" Crockett said, and Bunce said, "Remember that vote you cast for relief for those fire victims in New York?" Crockett said, "Well, yes, but you can't begrudge that. They were in desperate need, and we had a surplus in the Treasury." By the way, don't forget, Treasury surpluses are more dangerous than deficits. When government has a surplus, they immediately start thinking of new ways to spend it, usually unconstitutional ways. And Bunce said, "It is not the amount, sir, or the charity. It is the constitutional principle. You are authorized by the Constitution to tax and spend for three purposes: to pay debts, and you know this wasn't a debt; to provide for the common defense, and you know this had nothing to do with defense; and to promote the general welfare." This didn't promote the general welfare, it promoted the specific welfare of those fire victims. You violated your oath of office. and I shall not vote for you again. Crockett said, I hadn't thought of it that way, but you are absolutely right. I'm not going to ask you to vote for me, but if you would call a meeting of farmers, I will come to that meeting, I will publicly apologize for that vote, and I will publicly promise never to vote that way again. Well, Bunce called the meeting, and Crockett made the apology and the promise. I don't think history records whether Bunce voted for him or not, but he was reelected. And in the next session of the legislature, there was a bill to provide a pension for a widow. And looked like it was going to pass when Crockett stood up. And he recounted his promise to Horatio Bunce. And he said, this is not for defense. This is not a debt. This is not for the general welfare. He went on to say, I am the poorest man in Congress. I cannot vote for this bill, but I'm willing to give 1 week's pay to this widow, and if everybody else will do the same, it'll be more than the bill calls for. Well, the bill was then either tabled or defeated, and Crockett wrote later, though, that when he passed his hat or his coonskin cap, he was the only one who contributed. He noted that congressmen are much more willing to spend the taxpayers' money than they are their own. But the important thing out of this story is, what kind of country would we have today if we had 100 million Horatio Bunces out there who know what the Constitution says, know what limits it imposes on government, and refuse to vote for those who violate those limits? What kind of country would we have if we had several hundred congressmen like Davy Crockett who, even if they don't know the Constitution, they're willing to learn from somebody like Horatio Bunce? So what I'm saying is prepare, learn, know the facts. You can attend seminars like this. There is all sorts of good reading material that you can pick up here that will help you learning in these areas. Listen to things in the car. That's when I do a lot of my studying while I'm driving. Listen. That's one of the reasons I normally prefer CDs and audio cassettes to video cassettes and DVDs. I have a real problem with DVDs. I tend to run into telephone poles while I'm watching them. You can be listening to CDs while you're doing housework or field work or things like this. Think of the ways you can use some of your time to inform yourself. And before you know it, you'll find that you are the person that other people are coming to for information. That puts you in a position where you can be of influence in the culture war. Fifth thing I'm going to suggest, go to the center of gravity. That's a term we use in the military, where the heat of the battle is going on, where the most decisive phase of the battle is going on. Go to the center of gravity. That is, where is it that the decisions are being made and where the controversy is taking place? Now, you look for a fight, and probably here you're maybe like most people in most other states, where when you find out there's a fight, you want to find out what's it about, who's involved, who's right, who's wrong. Well, in Alabama, we just ask, where is it and how can we get there? But let's say that you are really, really upset about abortion. You think the Supreme Court was wrong on Roe versus Wade, and I thoroughly agree it was. And so you immediately go down to the city council to protest the decision on Roe versus Wade and demand that it be overturned. What's the problem? City council doesn't have a whole lot to do with it, do they? And of all the branches of government, the hardest to influence is the judiciary. But the point I am making is, find out who makes the decision. Find out who has the power to change the decision. And concentrate your fire there. Not that we don't have to educate others as well, but see where the center of gravity is and take the battle there. I'll give you a sixth principle. Don't burn bridges. We had a really serious battle some years ago in Alabama over having a state lottery. Alabama is one of the states that does not have a lottery yet, but there was a strong effort in Alabama to get one. Of course, they advertised it as though this will be the education lottery because the proceeds for this will be used for education, and if you're for kids having a good education, then certainly you should be for a lottery, aren't you? Well, states that have had lotteries that are dedicated to education, people in those states usually are disappointed in the results. Usually, if those profits from the lottery are earmarked for education, it just means that a similar amount is subtracted from the general fund. It doesn't really work that way at all. But the Southern Baptist Convention were strong allies of ours. Methodists were strong allies of ours. But the Catholic Church was not. Disappointed about that. They weren't very good allies. Some individuals were, but they were afraid it might interfere with Saturday night bingo and so on, and we're disappointed. Now, we could write them off and say, okay, that's the last time we ever try to work with you on anything. But we don't do that. Because the next issue may be the right to life issue, and the Catholics will be the best allies that you have. And the Methodists, who are many times very good allies on the lottery issue, may not be with you on the right to life issues. What I'm suggesting, in other words, is don't burn bridges. Recognize that even though you and this person or this organization are on opposite sides on this issue, in the next issue, you may have something in common, and you may be able to work together. So don't let some nasty words that you say now prevent an alliance in the future. One way of doing that, and this I strongly recommend to you, concentrate on issues, not personalities, and not organizations. Don't talk so much about the people involved. Talk about the issues and the facts and the principles behind them. That way, it sounds less like a personal attack on somebody else. So that's the sixth point. You look at some of the points we've made here. We've talked about how we need to know we're in a culture war. We need to know what the culture war is all about. We need to know the rules of engagement. We need to prepare. We need to go to the center of gravity where the decisions are made. We shouldn't burn bridges. Now let's look at a seventh principle here. Practice. Go on the talk shows. Lobby before legislators. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to go to the halls of the legislature to do so. Just call your legislator. Talk to him about it. Write letters to the editor, just letters to your friends. By the way, if you write letters to the editor, might I suggest, again, know the rules of engagement. And by the rules of engagement, I'm talking about the rules of grammar and spelling and punctuation. Not that those are the law of God necessarily, but they provide not only clarity, but also credibility. If a legislator gets a letter from somebody that is filled with spelling errors and grammar errors and so on, he may disregard that it actually has some good things to say, that there are some valid points in it. In other words, good grammar, spelling, and punctuation gives you credibility. So practice. And recognize that as you do, you're going to make mistakes. If I'm at all effective as a debater, it's because I have made an idiot out of myself so many times that I've learned a few things that don't work. I had one about a year ago. I partway walked into this trap. I didn't walk into it all the way, but I am a knight and chaplain with the Sovereign Military Order of the Temple of Jerusalem, the Knights Templar, not the Masonic Templar, certainly not the Da Vinci Code type Templars, but In fact, in our organization, you have to be a Christian to belong, and to be a chaplain, you have to adhere to the Nicene Creed. But at a meeting once, there were a few people that held the Da Vinci Code view that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were lovers and had a child named, I believe it was Sarah, if I recall correctly, according to their view, and that she became the mother of the Merovingian line of kings and so on. And it is such a twisted reading of history. It takes just a few facts way out of context and ignores a wealth of information that contradicts all of this. But this man was insisting to me that Jesus was married. Well, then he asked me a question. Was Jesus a rabbi? How about it? Was Jesus a rabbi? How many of you would say Jesus was a rabbi? Several of you say yes? Well, I didn't say he was a rabbi. I said, well, he is called rabbi several times. Right away, my opponent countered and closed his trap. According to Jewish law, to be a rabbi, you have to be married. Well, as I said, he is called a rabbi, not necessarily that he was a full rabbi. Well, I didn't really have the answer at that time. And many times, if you're put on the spot with a question, the best thing you can possibly say and do is, I don't know the answer to that, but I will check it out and I'll get back with you. Anyway, I've checked it out, and the answer is that the term rabbi can refer to a specific order. And to belong to that order that was known as rabbis, you had to be married. But the term rabbi was also used for anyone who was a teacher. And there is no evidence that Jesus was ever a rabbi in anything but that second sense. But I just barely avoided getting trapped thoroughly, and I did get trapped somewhat with that question, but I learned something from it. The next time I hear a question like that, I'll anticipate it and know what to respond and what not to respond. But like I say, you learn by making mistakes. I remember the story told about this one chief executive of a company who was making mega bucks, and a young junior executive asked him, why do they pay you that kind of money to be CEO? And he said, because I can make good decisions. And he said, well, I'd like to do that. How did you learn to make good decisions? And he answered, by making bad decisions. But he didn't learn by making bad decisions. He learned by making bad decisions and then learning from them. Anytime you're involved in a debate, whether it's a formal setting or just an informal discussion, think about it afterward. What did I say that seemed to make sense? What did I say that could have been said better? In other words, practice. And practice does make perfect, or nearly perfect. 8th point, help the average American to identify with you and with your position. Now, how can you do that? Well, I'm thinking back to 1980. Who was the candidate for president in 1980? Anybody? Ronald Reagan, okay. I was in Fergus Falls at that time. I was attending the Lutheran Seminary, and I was practicing law. And I found something interesting. I found that the other lawyers in the law firm were mostly for George Bush, the elder George Bush. My dentist was for George Bush. My doctor was for George Bush. My banker was for George Bush. But my auto mechanic was for Reagan. My postal carrier was for Reagan. The milkman was for Reagan. He even had a sticker for Reagan on the back of his milk truck. What's my point? Anybody see it? What? Blue-collar workers were for Reagan, while professionals were for Bush. But that can't be, because Reagan was the more conservative candidate, and professional people are conservative and blue-collar workers are liberal. So that can't be. At least that's the way it computes in the liberal mind. The point is, Reagan had a way of making the average worker identify with him and with his values. He could come across as one of them. He could come across as one who understood their problems, their way of life, what they were concerned about. And that's why he is called today the great communicator. Fascinating book that I picked up for $1 recently is titled, What's the Matter with Kansas? And the author, a man that I'd never heard of before by the name of Thomas Frank, essentially is talking about why it is that Kansas is one of the most conservative states in the country. He notes that there is a county in western Kansas that, in terms of per capita annual income, has the lowest annual income of any county in the entire United States. And yet, in the year 2000, 80% of the voters in that county voted for George Bush instead of for George Bush's Democratic opponent, Al Gore. That shouldn't happen. Poor people are supposed to be for Al Gore. It's only rich people that are supposed to be for Bush. That's not the way things are supposed to be, in his view. Just shouldn't happen that way. In fact, he even quotes another source there, saying he quotes another source as an authoritative way of saying I can't remember who he quoted. But he quotes another source as saying nobody who has ever worked for an employer should ever vote Republican. And I can't think of any reason why any employee should ever vote for a Republican or a conservative, unless maybe it's because he hopes his employer will be on a sound financial basis so his paychecks don't bounce. Or unless maybe it's because he thinks robbing from the rich and giving to the poor is not scriptural. Or unless he thinks that socialism just doesn't work well for poor or rich alike. But then he goes on to talk about blue states, the states that voted for Democrats at that time, versus red states, the states that voted for Bush and Republican at that time. He has an interesting chapter titled Deep in the Heart of Redness. But here's an interesting quotation that he gives. Quotation from a liberal who is describing what a blue state resident is like. He says, we in the coastal metro blue areas read more books and attend more plays than the people in the red heartland. We're more sophisticated and cosmopolitan. Just ask us about our alumni trips to China or Provence, or our interest in Buddhism. But please don't ask us what life in red America is like. We don't know. We don't know who Tim LaHaye is. We don't know what James Dobson says on his radio program. We don't know about Reba or about Travis. Very few of us know what goes on in Branson, Missouri, or could name even 5 NASCAR drivers. We don't know how to shoot or clean a rifle. We can't tell a military officer's rank by looking at his insignia. We don't know what soybeans look like when they're growing in a field. And then he quotes a fellow from a red state. And here's the way he describes red state people. Most red Americans can't deconstruct postmodern literature, can't give proper orders to a nanny, can't pick out a Cabernet with aftertones of licorice, or quote prices from the Abercrombie and Fitch catalog. But we can raise great children, wire our own houses, make beautiful and delicious creations with our own hands, talk casually and comfortably about God, repair a small engine, recognize a good maple sugar tree, tell you the histories of our towns and the hopes of our neighbors, shoot a gun and run a chainsaw without fear, calculate the bearing load of a roof, grow our own asparagus. What's the picture that these two are painting? A liberal is arrogant, elitist, off in an ivory tower where he doesn't really understand the needs and desires of the common man. The conservative may not be very cultural, but he does understand the common man's concerns and he shares the common man's interests. Now, the author is saying, that's what's the matter with Kansas. And Thomas Frank, by the way, is a liberal. See, that's the matter with Kansas. And what he's saying is, this is how conservatives won the heart of America. Much of that was in the Reagan era. Bush was able to carry that to some extent. But I think we have lost that. And one of the things that is essential is to understand the common man, how he thinks, what his values are, and to be able to demonstrate that his values are best promoted by our policies. One way of doing that is to be on the right side of these values and use the terminology that reflects that right side. For example, equality is a value that most Americans very strongly agree with. And so in the battle over whether or not a Christian organization should be able to use the high school auditorium on the same basis as everybody else, a bill was offered in Congress to make that law. It was passed. It was called the Equal Access Act. A good term, because it makes the ACLU and other opponents have to take the position we're against equality here. No, not usually, but here we're against equality. Or look at the questions about taxation. Now, one thing people believe in is fairness. Hardly anybody is for what he thinks is unfair. And so when we're talking about tax reform, there's a proposal in tax reform that we know as the fair tax. That's a good term, and I'm not necessarily saying that that is the way to go. I have some mixed feelings about it. At our Tea Party in Montgomery there a few days ago, there were people advocating the fair tax, and I said I wasn't sure, but I went on to say that it would have to be awfully bad to be worse than what we have right now, and so that's a point in our favor, but the term is, they used a term for it that would make most people instinctively get behind it. Right to life. Now, most people believe in life. Most people believe in rights. And for somebody to say that he is against the right to life really puts him at a disadvantage. And so they have come up with this term. I'm not pro-abortion. I'm pro-choice. Well, that's one you need to puncture every time you hear it. Unfortunately, many pro-life people will use the term pro-choice themselves for their opponents. I always say I am not or my opponents are not pro-choice. They are pro-abortion because they don't want to give that unborn baby a choice, and he's the one most affected by it. There is a county in Nevada where the Republican Party in that county put in their platform that we fully support the right to abortion so long as it does not end the life of an unborn child. Now, obviously, they did that tongue-in-cheek, but I said it this way, that I would support an abortion anytime you can get me the signed, notarized, informed consent of the unborn child. Now, it's used in other ways, too, that homeland security. Now, that raises both some positive signals and some negative signals that are in our minds. We think that certainly there's a need for security. We know there's a threat to our security, and we certainly want our homeland to be secure, but we also recognize there can be some dangers to civil liberties and some of the things that are being done there. Likewise, the Patriot Act, and I'll say about the Patriot Act that there are things in it I support, things that I do not. But choosing that term, whether it was chosen by friends or foes, was good terminology to use. The point I'm making is understand the basic values that Americans believe in: patriotism, home, security, equality, life, rights, fairness. To be able to couch our proposals in those terms, so long as you're doing it legitimately. If you don't, you'll be an object of ridicule. That is one way of helping the average person to know that our values, or his values, are best promoted by the policies that we advocate. And now I'm going to give you one more suggestion here. And this one is going to shock you a little bit, probably. This is what I said I was going to say this afternoon, and I said, no, I'm going to save this for tonight. Follow the command of the book of Genesis. Be fruitful and multiply. This is the main way we are winning the culture war. Fundamental Christians, homeschoolers, traditional Catholics, and Mormons are having large families, while liberals are exterminating their offspring. Do the math and see where that's going to end up in the long run. The only thing is, they make up for it by illegal immigration. But you can be fruitful and multiply and strike a victorious blow for the culture war all at the same time. Now, a 10th thing I'm going to suggest is personal holiness and prayer. Unless you have your own act together and your own family's act together, you're not going to be very effective in the culture war. I can recall back in the days when the Operation Rescue was the big news, and I participated in the legal defense of rescuers, testified as an expert witness in rescuer cases and so on. But I had cases of ladies, for example, that were involved in rescues, and turned out that the family farm was just about in bankruptcy at the time, and the family was not behind them. They wanted them back home. Keep your family together, keep your life together, and make sure that you are regularly praying to God, because prayer is perhaps the most important and most potent weapon that we have. And then there's one thing else that I'm going to stress in closing here, and this is from the book of Jeremiah. Now, you remember Jeremiah was writing at the time when the southern kingdom has gone into captivity in Babylon. He is writing from Jerusalem most of the time, whereas Daniel, his contemporary, is writing from Babylon. But Jeremiah, in Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 4 through 7, has some words of advice for those who are living in Babylon, the Jewish captives who have been taken to Babylon. He says in chapter 29, verse 4, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, unto all that are carried away captives, whom I have caused to be carried away from Jerusalem unto Babylon." You recall the captivity was to be for 70 years. "Build ye houses and dwell in them, and plant gardens, and eat the fruit of them. Take ye wives, and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons, and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters, that ye may be increased there, and not diminished. And seek the peace of the city." And the word peace there, the word shalom, means not only peace, but welfare in general. "Seek the shalom of the city, whither I have caused you to be carried away captives, and pray to the Lord for it. For in the peace thereof shall you have peace." He is speaking to people who have been carried away captive to a pagan empire, telling them that they should remain there, that they should participate in the affairs of the city, they should work, they should build houses, they should conduct regular lives there, raise families there. Because, he said, as that city or that empire is prosperous and successful, you will be prosperous and successful as well. Now, we haven't been carried away captive, but it seems like we've lost a lot of the America that we've loved. In fact, I could make a strong argument, and I'm not going to take the time to do this here, that the constitutional republic that our founding fathers established has become an empire. We are not citizens of the constitutional republic of America anymore. We are citizens of the American empire. I wish that wasn't the way it was. And we must never forget the principles of the republic. And we must never cease working for its restoration. Rome was going through much the same thing as Rome was being transformed from a republic into a democracy. And you find that the founding fathers, while they didn't have a whole lot of respect for the Greeks, they did have some respect for the Romans. But the Romans that they respected were not the Caesars, the builders of empire. They were the defenders of the old Roman virtues in the old Roman Republic, like Cicero, like Cato the Elder and Cato the Younger, like Virgil, and yes, even like Junius Brutus, the first and the second. We are living in an empire, but I think God would have us be citizens and good citizens of the empire. And God can use the American empire just like he used the Babylonian Empire to destroy the Assyrians, and just as he used the Persian Empire to destroy the Babylonians. In the last century, God used the American empire to defeat Nazism, and he used the American empire to deliver some very serious blows, though not totally defeat communism. It may be that in this century, God will use the American empire to defeat Islam. So be citizens of the empire and support the empire, but always keep the ideals of the republic in mind and always work for the restoration of those ideals. I'd like to close with a word of prayer. And for prayer, I'd like to use the prayer that Rudyard Kipling wrote. By the way, I encourage you to read Rudyard Kipling, not to agree with everything he said, but when you agree with him, he is magnificent. But you remember that prayer of his? It's been made into a hymn. It's called Recessional, sung to the same tune as the Navy hymn, Eternal Father, Strong to Save. Let's pray that together. I mean, you probably don't know it, but join me silently in prayer. God of our fathers, known of old, Lord of our far-flung battle line, beneath whose awful hand we hold dominion over palm and pine. Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget. The tumult and the shouting dies, the captains and the kings depart. Still stands the ancient sacrifice, an humble and a contrite heart. Judge of the nations, spare us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget. Far flung our navies melt away, as sinks the flame upon the pyre. Lo, all our pomp of yesterday is one with Nineveh and Tyre. Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget.